If you have type O positive blood, your body is carrying a record older than your name, older than your country, and older than any history book ever written. For most of the 20th century, doctors treated blood type as a small administrative detail, a letter on a hospital form, a code used only when someone needed a transfusion. But the moment researchers started sequencing the DNA sitting behind that single letter, the entire story changed. Type O positive turned out to be one of the clearest fingerprints of human migration on the planet, and the deepest layer of that fingerprint points straight into the heart of Asia. What modern genetic studies have uncovered about type O carriers is quietly rewriting how scientists think about ancestry, migration, and disease survival. By the end of this video, you won't look at your blood type the same way again. If ancient DNA and hidden human history fascinate you the way it fascinates us, go ahead and subscribe now, because this is exactly the kind of research mainstream coverage tends to skip right past. The story of blood typing itself starts in 1901, when an Austrian scientist named Karl Landsteiner noticed something strange happening in his lab. When he mixed different blood samples together, some clumped up violently while others stayed completely smooth. He just stumbled onto the existence of human blood groups, arguably one of the most important classification systems in the history of medicine. Landsteiner identified 4 basic types: A, B, AB, and O. For decades afterward, the working assumption in biology was that type O was simply a blank slate, a default, almost a placeholder compared to the more active A and B types. It took modern DNA sequencing to reveal just how much history was actually packed inside that supposedly simple letter. The blood type gene sits on chromosome 9, and it codes for an enzyme that decides which sugar molecules, called antigens, get attached to the surface of your red blood cells. Type A cells carry one specific sugar. Type B cells carry a different one. Type AB carries both. Type O carries neither, because the version of the gene that produces type O has a small deletion that breaks the enzyme's ability to attach any sugar at all. In evolutionary terms, the A and B versions of this gene are actually the older ones. Researchers have found the same A and B genetic pattern in other primates, including gorillas, orangutans, and several species of monkey, which means this polymorphism has likely been maintained for millions of years across multiple species. The O version came later, arising from a loss-of-function mutation, but later is relative here, because scientists have confirmed the O mutation is still extraordinarily old. When researchers sequenced ancient DNA from 2 Neanderthal individuals found at the El Cedron site in Spain, they discovered the exact same diagnostic deletion responsible for modern type O blood, meaning this mutation likely existed before Neanderthals and modern humans even split into separate lineages, pushing its age back well over 500,000 years, possibly close to 1 million. So while type O isn't the original blood type the way some assume, it is ancient enough that it was already circulating in the human genetic pool long before modern Homo sapiens ever left Africa. And once you start mapping how it spread and concentrated across different populations, the patterns get genuinely hard to ignore. In Western Europe, type A shows up in roughly 40% of the population. In parts of northern India, type B reaches some of its highest concentrations anywhere on Earth. Across sub-Saharan Africa, the distribution is mixed but fairly balanced among all 3 types. But in indigenous populations of the Americas, before European contact ever altered the gene pool, type O reached numbers that genuinely startled researchers. In some communities, close to 100% of individuals carried type O. Not a majority, not even a strong majority, nearly everyone. That kind of extreme concentration doesn't happen by random chance. It's the signature of what geneticists call a founder effect, meaning a small original population carried a particular gene, and because that population was the starting point for everyone who came after, the gene became almost universal in their descendants. This is exactly where the Asian connection becomes impossible to ignore. Every serious line of evidence on Native American origins, skeletal analysis, mitochondrial DNA, full genome sequencing, points to a small founding population that crossed from Northeast Asia into the Americas, likely during a prolonged pause in Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska. This is often referred to as the Beringian standstill hypothesis, the idea that a group of ancestral Asians spent thousands of years isolated in this region before finally pushing into the Americas, and they carried their blood type with them the entire way. Across modern Asia today, type O remains one of the most common blood types, though the exact numbers shift significantly by region. In the Philippines, roughly 45% of the population carries type O. In Vietnam, it sits close to 42%. In North India, type B climbs sharply due to different ancient migration patterns, but type O still maintains a strong presence throughout the subcontinent. The point isn't that all of Asia is uniformly type O, because it clearly isn't. The point is that Asia holds an enormous reservoir of type O genetic variation. And that reservoir appears to be the wellspring many of the world's other type O populations ultimately trace back to. When researchers directly compared the specific DNA sequences responsible for type O across different continents, they found something worth pausing on. The mutations that disable the gene aren't identical everywhere. There are multiple distinct ways this gene can break to produce the same O phenotype. And the specific version most commonly found in East Asian populations, often labeled the O1 or O2 variant in the scientific literature, carries its own distinct genetic signature, complete with small surrounding markers that let researchers trace its path backward through time. And that trail consistently leads deep into the Asian continent's past. There's also a layer of ancient interbreeding tangled up in this story that rarely gets discussed. Modern humans, moving through Asia over the last several tens of thousands of years, didn't arrive on an empty landmass. They encountered other human species who had already been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals across western and central Eurasia, and Denisovans, a mysterious sister group to Neanderthals identified primarily through DNA extracted from a single finger bone found in a Siberian cave, spread across parts of Asia and the Pacific. Genetic studies specifically comparing ABO gene variants across Neanderthal and Denisovan remains have found that some of these archaic populations carried O-type variants of their own, some shared with specific modern human populations, and some entirely unique to the archaic lineages themselves, suggesting a genuinely tangled web of interbreeding and gene sharing stretching back further than most people realize. Combine that ancient layering with the Rh positive marker, and you land on a blood profile, O positive, that ends up statistically dominant across huge stretches of Asia, and the populations descended from it. It's the most common blood type on the planet today, and it carries one of the deepest Asian ancestral fingerprints of any genetic marker we can currently trace. So why did type O spread and persist so successfully? The most compelling explanations researchers have proposed center on disease. Throughout most of human history, the deadliest threats to survival weren't predators or warfare, they were infections, plagues, and parasites. And blood type turns out to have a real measurable relationship with how the human body handles disease. Type O carriers, on average, show a lower risk of developing the most severe complications from certain strains of malaria, specifically the deadly cerebral form caused by Plasmodium falciparum, because red blood cells lacking the A and B antigens appear to bind less efficiently to infected cells, limiting how severely the infection can progress. Type O individuals also appear to show a somewhat different vulnerability profile to several bacterial infections. And more recent research emerging out of the COVID-19 pandemic suggested people with type O blood may have carried a modestly lower risk of severe illness from the virus, compared to a slightly elevated risk observed in people with type A, though researchers are careful to note this research is still developing, and the effect size appears fairly small. None of this makes type O some kind of biological shield. It isn't. But across hundreds of thousands of years and countless waves of disease, even tiny survival advantages compound. A blood type that gives you just a slightly better chance of surviving childhood during a major disease outbreak will, generation after generation, gradually dominate the local gene pool. That's one of the leading explanations for why type O climbed to such extreme frequencies in indigenous Asian populations, and by extension, in their descendants across the Americas and the Pacific. There is, however, a real cost that comes with all of this. Type O blood is statistically associated with a higher lifetime risk of certain conditions, most notably stomach ulcers, particularly in connection with a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. Researchers have found this bacterium binds more efficiently to the cell surface chemistry present in type O individuals, and there's a documented link between type O H. pylori infection and elevated rates of gastric cancer, especially in East Asian populations, where H. pylori infection rates are historically high. It's one of the genuinely open puzzles in modern blood genetics. Why would the same blood type that may have helped protect ancient Asian populations from one category of disease end up leaving their descendants more exposed to a completely different one? Evolution is full of exactly this kind of trade-off. Almost nothing comes free. Then there's one of the strangest edge cases in all of blood genetics, something called the Bombay phenotype, first identified in 1952 in the city of Bombay, now known as Mumbai. This is an extraordinarily rare blood profile where a person tests as type O using standard hospital methods, but is actually genetically distinct at a much deeper level. Bombay phenotype individuals lack a foundational sugar molecule called the H antigen, the base structure that both the A and B antigens are normally built on top of. Without that H antigen, the body simply cannot construct A or B markers, even if the underlying genes for them are technically present. On paper, these individuals look identical to type O. In reality, they can't safely receive standard type O blood in a transfusion because their immune system will still reject it. They can only safely receive blood from other Bombay phenotype donors, an incredibly small pool of people. This condition shows up most frequently on the Indian subcontinent, at a rate of roughly 1 in 10,000 people, compared to something closer to 1 in a million almost everywhere else on Earth. It's a genuine reminder that even within the broad category of type O, there are deeper layers of genetic variation that standard blood typing simply doesn't capture, and many of those hidden layers trace directly back to South Asia. Zoom out far enough, and the global picture of type O positive starts looking less like a medical category and more like an actual map, a map of where entire populations originated, who survived catastrophic disease events and who didn't, and the quiet, largely invisible migrations that carried ancestral Asians across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, out across the islands of the Pacific, and back westward across the Central Asian steppe toward the edges of Europe. Nearly every time researchers have carefully examined the genetic structure of type O positive populations anywhere in the world, Asia shows up somewhere in the background. Sometimes it's a recent connection, sometimes it's tens of thousands of years removed, filtered through countless generations of migration and mixing, but it's consistently there. Advances in ancient DNA extraction over roughly the past 15 years have only sharpened this picture. Researchers can now pull readable genetic material from human remains that are 5,000, 10,000, even 40,000 years old, sequencing the genomes of people who lived through the last ice age, through the earliest rise of agriculture, and through the emergence of the first true civilizations. Every time scientists have examined blood type markers in these ancient remains, they've added another piece to the puzzle. Type O appears to have already been widespread across East Asia at least 30,000 years ago. The ancestors of modern Native American populations appear to have carried even higher concentrations of type O than their present-day descendants do. Early Neolithic farming communities in China carried distinctive type O genetic variants that closely match patterns still found in southern Chinese populations today. Ancient DNA keeps confirming what modern population data already strongly suggested. Type O positive has genuinely deep roots running through Asian prehistory. There's another migration story worth pulling into this picture because it may be one of the most remarkable human journeys ever recorded in DNA. Around 5,000 years ago, a group of seafaring peoples originating from what is now Taiwan began a slow, extraordinarily deliberate expansion out across the Pacific Ocean, eventually populating islands separated from each other by thousands of miles of open water. This is generally referred to by researchers as the Austronesian expansion. Over the following several thousand years, nearly every population these seafarers eventually reached shows measurably elevated type O frequencies. Polynesian populations, in particular, carry some of the highest type O concentrations found anywhere on the planet, in some island communities approaching total saturation, sitting right alongside their distant genetic cousins in the Americas. Two of the most geographically isolated, far-flung human populations on Earth, separated by the largest ocean on the planet, both carrying strikingly similar ancient Asian blood signatures. The ocean didn't erase that inheritance. If anything, it preserved it, since island populations tend to stay more genetically isolated over time than mainland populations that keep absorbing new waves of migration. There are still open questions researchers haven't fully answered. Why is type B so disproportionately common in northern India compared to almost anywhere else on the planet? Some researchers believe it reflects an ancient migration wave originating from the Central Asian steppe, where type B may have first risen to unusually high frequency, while others argue it may simply reflect a strong local selective advantage tied to specific regional diseases. Why is type A generally the rarest of the four main blood types across East Asian populations relative to European ones? It may partly come down to simple math, since a higher regional prevalence of type B naturally increases the statistical odds of AB offspring, which in turn slightly suppresses how common pure type A becomes over generations. And why have certain highly isolated populations, including some indigenous communities in Taiwan and the Philippines, retained blood type frequencies that look almost identical to ancient Asian genetic profiles from thousands of years ago? The leading explanation is straightforward: relative isolation. These populations experienced far less genetic mixing with outside groups compared to mainland populations that absorbed wave after wave of incoming migration over the centuries. Every one of these open threads, when researchers pull on it long enough, eventually leads back toward the same broad Asian origin story. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, the two segments of the human genome that pass down in a single unbroken line, father to son and mother to daughter respectively, add their own independent layer of confirmation to all of this. East Asian populations commonly carry distinct Y chromosome haplogroups, particularly ones labeled O and C in scientific classification, that trace back to ancestral Asian populations living somewhere between roughly 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. Blood type is something you inherit without ever choosing it, You don't earn it, you don't select it, it's assigned to you the moment your parents' genetic material combines, and that combination traces back through an unbroken chain of ancestors, stretching back tens of thousands of years. Knowing that your type O positive blood traces back toward ancient Asia isn't just a piece of trivia about cellular chemistry, it's a form of inherited memory, a faint signal passed down from people who lived and survived tens of thousands of years before you were ever born. Every red blood cell in your body carries a sugar pattern, or in the case of type O, the deliberate absence of one that was effectively set in motion by those ancestors. If you're finding this as fascinating as we are, now's a good time to make sure you're subscribed, because the health implications of all this ancient inheritance are just as wild as the migration story itself. Modern medicine keeps uncovering fresh connections between blood type and everyday health outcomes. Type O positive carriers tend to show somewhat lower rates of certain cardiovascular conditions, particularly those tied to abnormal blood clotting, largely because type O blood naturally carries lower levels of a clotting protein called von Willebrand factor, along with reduced factor VIII activity. This tends to translate into a modestly reduced risk of dangerous blood clots, though it comes with a flip side, a somewhat increased vulnerability to serious bleeding in the event of major trauma or injury, since the same reduced clotting tendency that protects against clots works against you when you actually need blood to clot quickly. There's also a body of preliminary research suggesting mosquitoes may be disproportionately drawn to people with type O blood compared to other blood types. Though scientists studying this are quick to note the evidence base is still relatively limited and not yet considered fully conclusive. Even so, in regions where mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria and dengue remain a serious public health threat, this kind of blood type linked attraction pattern could carry real practical significance. The story of type O positive is ultimately a story about disease pressure meeting long-term survival. When researchers overlay a global map of blood type frequency against a historical map of major epidemics throughout human history, genuine patterns start to emerge. Regions hit hardest by specific historical plagues often show distinctive shifts in blood type distribution generations later. Populations that endured major smallpox outbreaks tend to show one set of patterns. Populations that survived recurring waves of bubonic plague show a different one. Populations that weathered the brutal, disease-dense environments common across tropical Asia, where parasitic and bacterial threats were a near-constant presence, show their own distinctive blood type signature, one that still echoes those ancient biological battles today. Type O ended up overrepresented across huge stretches of Asia and its descendant populations, not because anyone selected it, but because, generation after generation, the people who happened to carry it survived just slightly better when survival was the only currency that actually mattered. So, what does any of this actually mean for someone alive right now, glancing down at a medical chart and seeing the letter O followed by a plus sign? It means your blood carries a history older than any nation, older than any flag, older than any border ever drawn on any map. It means your ancestors, whoever and wherever they specifically were, lived through an almost unbroken chain of survival stretching back tens of thousands of years, a chain that, according to the genetic evidence, very likely passed directly through the heart of Asia at some critical point along the way. That doesn't mean your personal identity needs to be redefined around a single ancient migration route. It simply means the deep, sprawling history of human movement quietly touched your bloodstream, and that touch traces back to a continent whose central role in shaping the entire human story has often been underappreciated in traditional Western tellings of ancestry and history. The next time you glance at a hospital form, donate blood, or fill out a medical questionnaire and jot down the letters O and that small plus sign, it's worth remembering you're not simply describing a piece of chemistry. You're pointing directly at a thread that runs backward through every single ancestor who ever came before you in your line. A thread that doesn't begin in any clinic or hospital, but in caves, grasslands, and river valleys, stretching back tens of thousands of years on a continent where survival was genuinely difficult, and where the people who managed to endure quietly passed their blood forward, generation after generation, until it eventually reached you. Science is still very much in the early stages of fully understanding everything blood type actually represents. Ancient DNA extraction keeps getting faster and more precise. New connections between blood type, migration patterns, disease resistance, and long-term human adaptation are still being published on a regular basis. But the broad outline is already remarkably clear, and it keeps pointing back to the same place, toward the long migrations that moved out of Asia, toward the small genetic adjustments that gave certain ancestral populations a slightly better shot at surviving the next winter, the next epidemic, the next famine, and toward the quiet, persistent spread of a blood type that would eventually become the single most common one on the entire planet. If you carry type O positive blood, you're carrying a genuine piece of that history inside you right now. You're carrying the inheritance of survivors, the biological signature of one of the longest, deepest journeys any human population has ever undertaken. And thanks to modern genetic science, we finally have the tools to actually read what that inheritance has been quietly saying all along. So the next time someone asks about your blood type, you'll know there's a lot more behind that simple letter and plus sign than any hospital form could ever explain. What do you think your own bloodline's journey might look like? Let us know in the comments, subscribe if you want more deep dives into what your DNA is actually telling you, and we'll see you in the next one.